Today's reading from 1 Timothy is a really good jumping off point for where I'm heading for the next bunch of weeks. For the writer of this letter opens up some questions that will take some time to sort through, conundrums that will take time to unravel. From a seemingly unrelated set of admonitions to his young colleague Timothy, the writer sets up a really important question. What is the relationship between Christian faith and life in the broader culture? This is precisely the question our old friend H. Richard Niebuhr asks in his little book, Christ and Culture. Let's see what our letter writer has to say. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Saturday, June 1st, 2024. In the final chapter of 1 Timothy, the writer gives Timothy several pieces of advice concerning several seemingly unrelated topics. The first is the question of what a Christian slave's obligation is to his or her master. The second question concerns the relationship between the Christian believer and monetary wealth. The third question revolves around the relationship between earthly power and the authority that comes from God to apostles like Timothy. And the final question has to do with true wisdom. For today, we can only tackle the first question, but like the others, it raises a whole host of other questions. So we live in a world that is bigger than us. Most of us are unable to change the world around us, except maybe in small ways. But things like economic systems, social mores, societal practices like marriage and family are things that we just take as givens. We work within these institutions and for the most part just assume that they are part of our objective reality. Yes, some people are able to move the needle just a bit, but for the vast majority of us, the world around us seems like an objective reality. One of the consequences of this is that sometimes we countenance things that in a perfect world would not exist. One of those things is slavery. It took years and years of effort on the part of countless people and a civil war, for example, to eradicate the institution of slavery from America. But for most of human history, slavery in some form or fashion was the norm. That's why the writer of 1 Timothy addresses the responsibilities of slaves to their masters. If we were writing this letter today, we would likely tell an enslaved person to escape. Not Paul, and not because he would necessarily approve of slavery if he were alive today. Slavery was simply part of the world as he knew it, and the Christian church included both slaves and slave owners. Today, Paul's advice to slaves strikes us as offensive. He advises Timothy, those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are members of the church. Rather, they must serve them all the more, since those who benefit by their service are believers and beloved. That advice simply wouldn't fly today, but it does raise a really interesting question. Just because Paul advises slaves not only to remain in their servitude, but also to serve their fellow Christian masters even more faithfully, does this mean that the Bible affirms slavery? And if not, then what do we make of other places in the Bible that assume social practices and institutions we no longer accept? So almost no one today would seriously argue, based on the Bible, that slavery is acceptable. But in the 19th century, plenty of people, especially in the American South, absolutely relied on today's passage, among others, to justify slavery. What changed? Clearly, the text of the Bible hasn't changed. We have. Or more precisely, the world around us has changed. Culture has changed. And therefore, the relationship between Christian faith and life in the world has changed as well. Let me cut to the chase here and suggest two things this means for us. First, the relationship between the Christian community and the broader culture is an ever-evolving thing. What we take in one generation to be normal can become outdated and antiquated in the next. The world and its institutions evolve and change. Those changes constantly call for the Christian community to evolve as well. Second, as the world changes, we constantly have to re-examine our interpretation of the Bible. Some would say that if the Bible doesn't change, neither should our interpretation of it, but this ignores the plain truth that the church has always evolved in its understanding of what Scripture leads us to believe and do. It's not a matter of ignoring the Bible. It's a matter of reassessing where the Bible as a whole leads us. I have suggested before that not all biblical texts are equal in importance. Even if they don't acknowledge it, even hard-shell fundamentalists interpret Scripture in light of a kind of canon within the canon. As Reformed Christians, we're simply more open and honest about which texts are the ones through which we interpret other texts. So, for example, we don't hold up Paul's advice to slaves as a text through which we interpret other texts. We don't use it to interpret the rest of Scripture. As I suggested a moment ago, this sets us up for a series of devotionals in the weeks ahead, in which I want to talk about H. Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture, which is an extended analysis of these very questions. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.